Masechet Ketubot, Daf Mem, we begin with the new Mishnah, Yetoma shenit aresa v'nit garesha, Rabbi Elazar Omer ha'ones hayav v'hamefate patur. A girl, Na'ara, who is an orphan, who also was betrothed and divorced. We're going to see that actually we don't need both of these categories. This is either or. If she's an orphan, her father died, or even if she has a father, if she was betrothed and divorced, the law would be the same. As we'll explain, Rabbi Elazar says that the rapist does have to pay a fine, but the seducer does not have to pay a fine. Let's explain the Yetoma. If she was in fact an orphan without a father, so the rapist still has to pay the fine, just the fine doesn't go to the father because he's not around, rather the fine goes to her directly. Fine. Now, if it's a seducer, well, if there's a father around, then the seducer has to pay the father. If there's no father around to claim it, then she doesn't get it because she agreed. And with her consent, her giving consent is the same as her foregoing the right to a fine. And anybody can forego their right to a monetary obligation. And therefore, since there's no father around, the seducer does not have to pay any fine not to the father who's not around and not to her. Okay, that's the case of orphan. Gemara is going to show that the same would be a case of someone who has a father, but who's engaged and now divorced, where because she was engaged and now divorced, she is now independent. And as an independent woman, same thing, where she would collect the fine from a rapist, but she can give her consent for her consent is good enough that it would be the same as foregoing the fine and doesn't go to the father. So let's see. Amar Abba bar Hana Amar Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Elazar b'shitat Rabbi Akiva Rabbo Amara. So Rabbi Yochanan explains that Rabbi Elazar, this is Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, who is a student of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is a third generation Tana. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua is one of his main 5 students in the 4th generation. And Rabbi Yochanan is pointing out that they actually agree with each other. That's his teacher. The Amar. After all, Rabbi Akiva said, this is in the Mishnah back on Daf Lamed Chet, we saw that Rabbi Akiva said, Yesh la knas uknasa le'atzma, in the very same case of a Na'ara who was betrothed and divorced. In that case, she keeps the knas. Once she goes through the process of being engaged and divorced, she gains independence, even though she's still a na'ara, to the effect that she gets the knas. So this is the same thing, the same principle. Since she gets the knas, if she is raped after she's divorced, so too the seducer would have to pay a knas to the father in a normal case, but in this case it would go to her since she agreed. So that's the same as her foregoing the knas. Okay, so so that's what Rabbi Yochanan saying. Okay, we ask, Mimai mitiketane yetoma Rabbi Elazar Omer haones chayav b'mfateh patur. How do you know that you should read this case independently? Not that she's an orphan and also she betrothed and got divorced, but that it would apply even if she was not an orphan and she betrothed and got divorced. Here, because it says orphan, and Rabbi Elazar says regarding the case of a girl who's an orphan that the rapist has to pay and the seducer does not have to pay the fine. Now we say Yetoma Peshita, isn't that obvious? That there would be no payment in the case of seducer. After all, there is no father to pay it to, and she says she was okay with it. So you don't even have to say the case of Yetoma. Ela hakamash balante na'ara shentar savit kasha ke Yetoma. Rather, must be that saying Yetoma here to tell us that Yetoma, who is like someone who has a father who was engaged and divorced, have the same law. Just like a girl who's an orphan, she keeps the fine. So too, if she was divorced, she also keeps the fine. That would be a case in both of those in case of rapist, and therefore, in the case of seduction as well, that is the same as she forgoes the right to the fine, and so he doesn't have to pay anything. Okay, this whole long list in the name of Rav says halacha ke Rabbi Elazar. Halacha is in fact like Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar stam without any added name, who's a Tana, is always going to be Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, this our fourth generation Tana. Kari Rav Ale de Rabbi Elazar Tobina de Chakime. And Rav said about him, he's the happiest of all sages, because here the halacha follows him here. In many other cases, also the halacha follows him, and so a person's always happy if his opinion turns out to be the one that is followed, the halacha. Good. Now, we mentioned before that the rapist seducer has to pay not only a fine, but also has to pay for humiliation, boshit, and pagam for degradation. Now we're going to define what those are in this Mishnah. Ezehu boshit. How do you assess what the humiliation is? Hakol lefi hamevayesh vehamitbayesh. Well, it's subjective. It depends on both who's doing the crime and the victim. If the victim is a princess, then her humiliation is going to be much more than if she's of a commoner class. That would be true, if someone got injured or insulted, or in this case, we're talking about raped. And mivaye, not insult. If any time there's an injury and the embarrassment part of the injury is more if she's a higher if the victim is a higher status. Now the mivayesh also, who's perpetrating the crime. Generally, if the perpetrator is a similar status as the victim, then the humiliation is less than if there is a wide gap between the class status of the one doing, in this case, the rape and the victim. So therefore, you have to assess each case on its own to see what would be the amount that we can, a dollar amount that we can put on the level of humiliation. Good. And regarding the degradation, that would be the amount that a person is worth on the slave market. So if we would sell this Na'ara as a maidservant beforehand, when she had her bitulim and she was not raped, and how much she is worth now that this rapist or seducer violated her, and what would be the difference in her market value, that's one of the things that are paid. The Gemara will discuss why her losing her bitulim would have any effect on her market value. We understand it has an effect on her marriageability, and that's what the whole fine is for, because now she will be less marriageable. People are going to pay in the ketubah the amount not for a betula, the 200, but only the 100, like an almanah. And so since it'll be harder to marry her off and get the same price, so that's what the fine covers. So that's on the marriage market. But here, in addition to that fine, he has to pay how much the difference is on the slave market. This is true, by the way, for all injury. If someone cuts off someone's arm, then he has to pay. One of the 5 things that he has to pay is the difference in amount that a person would get on the slave market. Kanas shaveh bechol adam. The fine is the same no matter what. Doesn't matter if the victim is a princess or a low class or who the perpetrator is. It doesn't matter. The fine is always 50 shekel. And that's not only true for this fine, but all fines in the Torah. Anytime it gives some kind of monetary value regarding a person, it doesn't matter what the class status is. That's true for arachim, if someone donates their worth. It doesn't matter what class they're in. The same is true for Pidyon Haben. It doesn't matter if this is this child is the firstborn of a king or firstborn of a commoner. It's always the same amount, which is actually a really important point because in many other legal systems, like in the Hammurabi Code and even Aristotle, they say, well, it depends on if it's a high-class person, a low-class person, you pay different amounts. And Torah says, no, everybody is the same. In regard to fines. Humiliation, we can understand that there's a subjective value in that, but fines doesn't matter. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now we're going to analyze each aspect. How do you know that you have to pay these 3 or 4 different things for the seduction and the rapist. How do you know? The Torah says, pay 50 shekel. Maybe that covers everything. He only has to pay 50 shekel, and that will cover the humiliation and degradation as well. How do you know? Okay, that's the question. Now, Rabbi Zera is going to attempt two answers. Amar Rabbi Zera, Yomeru Baal Bat Melachim Hamishim, Baal Bat Hejot Hamishim. He says that doesn't make sense because just think about the public perception. Would people think that, would it make sense to people that if the rapist raped a princess, he pays 50, and if he rapes a commoner, also it would be 50? But the degradation, the humiliation is completely different. So certainly there has to be a difference in amount. So it's just logical that there would have to be another element besides the fine. Yeah, the fine is equal for everybody, but there has to be an element of humiliation that would be different. So just logically, it can't be, Rabbi Zera says. But Abaye rejects Rabbi Zera's challenge. Amar le Abaye yachi ka'ba'eved nami yomru eved nokeb margaliyot sheloshim eved ose ma'aseh machat sheloshim. So people would say also, regarding the value of a slave, people will think that there should be a difference in depending on what the slave does. Now, here's background. The actual Torah law regarding a slave is im eved yigach hashod o ama kesef sheloshim shekalim. If someone's ox goes and gores and kills a slave or maidservant, then he has to pay 30 shekalim and the ox dies. But the law is the same across the board. You pay 30 shekel no matter what the value of the slave is. So that is the law. And by your logic, Rabbi Zera, you're thinking about the common perception. The common perception would be that, it can't be that if they have a slave who works on pearls, they're very highly skilled slave whose skill is very valuable, that they get 30, and a slave that makes needles, which is a very common lowly task and not worth much, also would get 30. But in fact, that is the law. Yes, so even though people perceive things differently and say, well, there should be a difference between a more valuable slave and less valuable slave in terms of what they do, there should be a difference between the rape of a princess and a commoner because of their humiliation. But the law is not that way in either case. So, yes, it could be that the standard amount of 50 shekel will cover all cases. So, Rabbi Zera, your argument of what people think is really not valid, says Abaye. So Rabbi Zera can fix his language a little bit, still won't work, but Ela Amar Rabbi Zera, Ilu ba'u aleha shenayim, echad kedarka ve'echad shelo kedarka, yomeru ba'al shelema chamishim, ba'al peguma chamishim. So Rabbi Zera is going to give another example. Okay, it's not really clear here exactly what the case is. The Rishonim have some different variations on it, but we'll try to keep it simple. Let's say we're talking about one woman, and to switch the order of the verbs here. The first one is ba'aleh shelo kedarka, unnatural intercourse. And we're going to follow Yerushalmi that says that this rapist pays the na'ara with whom he had unnatural intercourse 50 shekel. Okay, so now he paid. Now afterwards, someone comes and has bi'ah with her, rapes her, kedarka, in the normal intercourse. And he would also pay 50 shekel. We're constructing a case this way because we want to think of a case where the woman receives two fines. Normally, if it's regular intercourse, only the first one would have to pay. Then she's not a betula anymore, so the second one wouldn't have to pay. But here, because the first one was shelo kedarka, she's still a betula, and the second one also has to pay. So in this case, where you have two people, and they're both paying, hold on, Baal Shelema Hamishim, Baal Peguma Hamishim, should both of them pay the same amount regarding humiliation? Her humiliation is what we're assuming psychologically is that the humiliation from the first one would be greater. Whereas once she already experienced humiliation of being raped the first time, the second time is also humiliating, but less humiliating psychologically, emotionally. And so people will say, wait a second, should it be the same? It doesn't make sense it should be the same. So therefore, there has to be another element besides the 50 shekel of humiliation humiliation that will depend on a case-by-case basis. So in this formulation, it's not based on her class of being a princess or not, but rather something integral to her status. To her state, rather, her internal state. And so this can be, this would make less sense even than the first one. So Abaye says, no, this logic also, he rejects Abaye. In the case of slaves, when the ox gores one, does it make any difference? Well, it doesn't make any difference whether it's healthy or sick. But in people's minds, it should make a difference. If the ox gored a healthy slave 30, and people will say, well, what if it had boils and the slave was sick? Then the payment should be less. Yet the Torah says it is in fact the same, and there is no other payment regarding slaves. So the comparison here is two things that are within the state. It's not just what the slave does, or that the one that the girl is a princess or not, but rather the internal state of the slave being healthy or sick, parallel to the woman being pure, untainted, and the second person already piguma, already tainted, where the humiliation is different. And yet we don't make a difference regarding a slave, and therefore logically we would not need to make any difference regarding the victim of the rape either. And so therefore Rabbi Zera's challenges are, Rabbi Zera's answers to the question are not rejected. And so we go back to the original question. How do you know that there's an additional payment besides the fine of humiliation and degradation? Maybe the Torah says 50 shekel, and that's it. And there's no other payment. Now we're going to have an answer. Rabbi Zera presumably kept his answer, but Abaye rejected it, so Abaye has his own answer. Ela amar Abaye. Amar kira tachat asher ina. You have to pay 50 shekel tachat, instead of, or because of the inui, because of the violation of her. Hane tachat asher ina miklal dika boshet upegam, which means the 50 shekel is the payment only for strictly the act of violating her and taking away her bitulim. But there is also other payments that will be her humiliation and degradation on the slave market, which is beyond just the act of rape or seduction by itself. Okay, so that's how we know the word tachat, that kind of extra word tachat, limits the fine to cover not everything that she is owed. Rava amar kerav natan ha'ish hashocheb ima la'abiha na'ara 50 kasef. Rava learns it from another different set of extra words. It says v'natan ha'ish. You could have just said la'abiha na'ara. The man will give, the will pay. Which man? Of course, the violator. I don't know if you don't have to tell me that it's the man who slept with her. Isn't that obvious that he's going to pay? No one else is going to have to pay. So it adds these words to teach that hana'at shechiva. He's paying for the pleasure that he got from being with her. That is 50 shekel that he has to pay. But in addition to that, there's also her humiliation and degradation that he will also have to pay. Mikladika boshet upegam. Okay, so now we've established that there does have to be, in fact, multiple payments, the 50 shekel plus the other 2 for a seducer and 3 for the rapist. In the case of rape, he has to pay also for her pain, sa'ar. But now our next question is ve'ema ledida. How do you know that it goes to the father, not the fine? The fine goes to the father. The pasuk says so. But what about the other, the payment of the humiliation and degradation? Maybe that should go to her. Who said that should go to the father? So Amar Kera bin Oreha bet Abiha Kol Shevach Neoreha leAbiha. We're going to learn it from the pasuk that the context of the pasuk is regarding the father's ability to annul his daughter's vows. And so it says, when can he annul her vows? When she is a na'ara bet avia, and she's living with her father, so the father has authority. And so we can expand from that any profits that the girl has goes to the father. And this is a kind of a profit, right? This is money that she deserves. It's a payment to her, but the father is in charge of everything in her life, and therefore it goes to the father. That's how we learn it. We reject this derivation. Rav asked, how do you know that the work that a daughter does goes to the father, right? If she produces some garments or whatever, that she sells it, the money goes to the father. Because the different pasuk says that if a man sells his daughter off as a maidservant, a father has a right. He's very poor, can't make ends meet, so he may sell his daughter off as a maidservant. Now, what's the status of a maidservant? Anything a maidservant does goes to the master. The master owns all of her work. So too, since the father has a right to sell his daughter as a maidservant, so too, even if she's not a maidservant, he has a right to everything she works. Okay, so that's how we know. Now, Maaseh Abiha. Now we ask, Lama li tepuk mi ben oreha bet aviha? Why can't you learn that from neoreha bet aviha? Right? We just saw that pasuk says, as long as she's a na'ara, she's in her father's house, the father has authority over her. So why don't we learn from there this very law that all of her work goes to the father? So no, the reason we don't learn it from there is because that benureh bet aviha is in the context of nullifying her vows. And so it only refers to nullifying the vows. The father has authority to nullify the vows of his daughter. But doesn't say anything about the monetary authority, and that's why we need a separate pasuk to teach ma'aseh yadeha. That her work goes to the father. So what are we left with now? Actually, we are left with no derivation that the father should get the boshet and pegam, because it's not nedarim, right? This has nothing to do with her vows, and this is also not work that she did. Work that she does, like a maidservant, if she does work, the father would get it. But this is not work, but rather this is just a fine that's coming to her on account of humiliation, degradation that she experienced. And so right now we don't have any source that the father should get it. Maybe she should get it herself. Okay, so let's try again. Maybe we should learn from vows. Just like the father's in charge of the daughter's vows, so too he should also get the fine. Not the fine. Rather, so too he should get the amount of her humiliation. No, you can't compare prohibitions, which is vows, has to do with prohibitions, to monetary. Prohibitions are a different and more stringent category, so you can't learn it from there. So let's learn it from the fine. Just like the father gets the fine, that's a monetary thing, so too the father will also get the humiliation, degradation. No, these are two different categories of money. One is talking about compensation that the father would get. One's talking about a fine, and a fine is over and above regular compensation in lots of cases. And so therefore, yes, while the Torah says the father gets the fine, doesn't necessarily mean that he gets the compensation. We can't learn one from the other. So rather we reject all these proofs and comparisons we had before. Rather it's basic logic, that after all, the father, if he wanted to, he can marry off his daughter, right? As a ketana or as a na'ara, he has a right to marry off his daughter to whoever he wants. And if he wanted, whatever reason, I don't know why he would do this, but he could marry off his daughter to a man who's repulsive, like if he has boils or he's disgusting in some way. And that would certainly be humiliating to her. She would experience humiliation, but the father has a right to do that. Since the father has a right to put his daughter in a situation of humiliation, therefore, it makes sense that if his daughter is humiliated, the father would get the money. And so that's how we know that the father gets, in the case that the na'ara is raped, the father gets the fine and the other payments. Okay, now, pegam. The Mishnah mentioned that the degradation is based on we look at her amount on the slave market before she was raped and after, or before she was seduced and after. So how do we assess this value. Amar Abu Shmuel Amdim Kama Adam Roseh Liten Ben Shivcha Betula Lishivcha Be'ula Leshamesho. So we make an estimation. How much would a person pay to have a maidservant who's a betula, or versus one who is a be'ula to serve him? We ask, why does a person care if his maidservant is a betula or a be'ula? Well, is she going to do laundry? She's going to make coffee? Well, who cares, right? It makes no difference, so her value should not change based on that. So rather, ela bet shivcha be'ula l'shivcha she'ena be'ula l'asiya l'abdo. No, it would make a difference because the owner may want to acquire a maidservant to marry her off to his slave. He has a male slave, and he wants the slave to bear children for him that he would own, and so he wants to give her his slave a woman to be with. So that's why it makes a difference if she's a betula or be'ula. Here also we ask, ulabdo my nafkala mina. Still, what's the difference? So what's the difference if she's a betula or not? He's just giving it to his slave, and the answer is be'evet sheyesh lo rabo korat ruach amenu. We're talking about a slave that the master likes. The master is satisfied with the work of his slave, and he wants the slave to be happy. And in general, the guy would prefer to have as a wife a betula rather than a be'ula, and so there is a difference in the price he would pay for the maidservant. If she's a betula, he would pay a little more than a be'ula, and so that is the amount that the rapist and seducer would have to pay in addition to the other payments. That's the difference in estimation of her market value. All right, and next Mishnah. Kol makom sheyesh mecher and kenas. V'chol makom sheyesh kenas and mecher. We've actually seen this Mishnah above, and it teaches that any time that a father has a right to sell his daughter into slavery, this is talking about a ketana. A father has a right to sell her while she's a ketana until 12. So until 12, and kenas, if she is raped before she's 12, the man does not pay a fine. The fine, this law of paying a fine only applies to na'ara 12 to 12 and a half. And flip side, kol makom sheyesh kenas and mecher, anytime that there is a fine, which means na'ara 12 to 12 and a half, and mecher, the father does not have a right to sell his na'ara into slavery. Okay, so they're mutually exclusive. In other words, right? There's na'ara until 12. Slave, yes, sell, but no fine. And then 12 to 12 and a half, yes, fine, but no selling. Ketana, yesh la mecher ve'en la kenas. When she's a ketana, yes, he can sell her. The father can sell her, but he doesn't collect the fine. Na'ara, yesh la kenas ve'en la mecher. When she's a na'ara, he collects the fine. He cannot sell her. Ve'abogeret and la lo mecher ve'lo kenas. Once she's passes 12 and a half, she is an adult, and then neither of these laws apply. The father does not have a right to sell her, nor does he collect the fine. There's no fine in that case. Okay, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. This whole Mishnah, Rav explains, is only the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Chachamim say, while she's a ketana and can be sold, also the fine applies. So according to Chachamim, the rapist has to pay the victim the whole time until from ketana and na'ara. Detanya, ketana mibat yom echad v'ad shetabi sheteh sa'arot yesh la mecher ve'en la kenas v'shetabi sheteh sa'arot ad shetibaged yesh la kenas ve'en la mecher divrei Rabbi Meir. So the first opinion is B'raita Zad of Rabbi Meir, who says that from a time that a girl is 1 day old until 2 hairs, that's around 12, that's called ketana. She can be sold, but there's no fine. But once she has 2 hairs until she becomes an adult, around 12 to 12 and a half, then she has a fine and cannot be sold. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Shayad Rabbi Meir, and we're quoting a further source that Rabbi Meir said, Kol makom sheyesh mecher, quoting yesh mecher and kenas, makom sheyesh kenas and mecher, which is exactly the language of our Mishnah. So you see, our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. What do Chachamim say? Chachamim אומרים ketana mibat 3 shanim v'yom echad ve'ad shetibager yesh la kenas. Chachamim say the entire time from when she is 3 years old and 1 day until she becomes 12 and a half, she does receive a fine. Before she's 3 years old, because that's not considered a sexual act, and the bitulim would grow back, therefore there's no kenas. But Chachamim do include child, ketana, and na'ara in the fine, so they cannot be the author of our Mishnah. Okay, so now we ask about Chachamim. Hold on, kenas in mecher la. So that means that when they are a child, they get kenas. We understand that. Does that mean that the father cannot sell the child into slavery? We're assuming that according to Chachamim, he would have the same principle that we said here, that if there is kenas, then there's no mecher. All right, what there is kenas and mecher. So, saying Chachamim, there is kenas for ketana. So the father can sell a ketana, but it can't be. That can't be true. That's the whole law of the Torah about selling. And by the way, when one sells one's daughter into slavery, it's not as bad as it sounds, although it's pretty bad. But because the master, once the girl grows up, the expectation is the master would marry her, or his son would marry her. It's kind of like the master is adopting her in a way, taking care of her until she grows up, and then really becoming part of the family in marriage. So, okay, anyway, so ve'ema af kenas b'mkom mecher. So rather, according to Hachamim, you can have both. You can have, in the case of ketana, both the fine and the father can sell it. Amar Rav Chisda, my tamad Rabbi Meir. How come Rabbi Meir says only one or the other? Amar kera ve'lo tiyeh le'isha b'mahava asma katub medaber. Since Pasuk says that should a man rape a woman, she becomes his as a wife. So velo tihiyeh, we learned yesterday that the word tihiyeh means that she has to agree to it. And so we add additionally here, Rabbi Meir is specifying that it's only talking about a ne'ara who could marry herself off. Once someone's a ne'ara, she has the right to go ahead and marry herself, right, even without the father. So since she can marry herself, she is called tihiyeh, and that's why the whole fine, this whole law, applies only when she's a na'ara, and not when she's a ketana. A ketana cannot marry herself off. She can only be married off by her father, midoraita. Okay, v'rabbanan, where do the rabbis learn it from? That even a ketana does, the fine does apply. Amar Resh Lakish, amar kera na'ara, afilu ketana b'mashma. Since Pasuk writes the word na'ara, chaser, without a hair. So if it was a full na'ara with a hair, then that would be 12 and a half. The missing a hair means a small na'ara, which means even less than a na'ara. So that comes to include na'ara and ketana. Also, the law of the fines applies. Good. Now, Shema'ara papa bered Rav Hanan mebe kelochit, azal amaral kameh Rav Shimi bar Asher. So the papa, the son of Rav Hanan from this place, be kelochit, went and repeated this halacha that Resh Lakish just said. We learn it from the diminutive na'ara. He said it to Rav Shimi bar Asher. And Rav Shimi bar Asher said back to him, Atun, aha matni tula. Oh, you learned Resh Lakish as applying to this law here of fines. Ana aha matni la. We also heard Resh Lakish say something similar, but we heard that he applied it to a different case of Mosi Shemra. Resh Lakish, Mosi Shemra ala ketana patur, shenemar v'natenu la'avia na'ara. Na'ara male diber katub. This is a case where the night after the wedding, when they consummate, the groom comes and says, hey, I saw no blood. She had no betulim. And you know why? Because she cheated on me after the kiddushin, and therefore she is an adulteress. And in that case, if it was true, she would go and she would get a sikila. Now, if it turns out that he is lying, the groom is lying, in fact she was a betula, and he was just lying to try to get out of his ketubot payment, then he gets punished and he has to pay 100 shekel, and he can never divorce her after that. So that's the law of Mosi Shem Ra. So Resh Lakish, he applied his statement to that the law of Mosi Shem Ra only applies to a Na'ara, but not a Ketana. Ketana, he would not have to pay this fine. Why? Because it says that Venatenu la'avia Na'ara, that fine of 100 goes to the father of the Na'ara. And Na'ara here is spelled with a he. So since it's spelled with a he, therefore, it's talking about only someone who is 12, not a ketana. So you see from here that if it was without a he, then it would be even with a ketana. Okay, so it's the same methodology, but Shakit, do you say about this one? No, Rav Shimi thinks he applied it originally to this other one, although you could derive one from the other, which is exactly what we're about to do. So Matkif la Rav Ada bar Ahava. Rav Ada bar Ahava says, hold on, you don't need this derivation that it says full Na'ara in order to teach me that only Na'ara, not a ketana. I could have figured that out by myself. So the only reason you're applying the law of Mosi Shemra to a Na'ara and not a ketana is because it says a he, but if not, otherwise you would have applied it even to a ketana. Can't be. The pasuk goes on and says that if it's true what his claim is, the groom's claim, that in fact she doesn't have betulim and she committed adultery between the kiddushin and the nisu'in, then they take her out in front of her father's house and stone her. Now, what kind of case would she get capital punishment? Uktana labat onoshinhi. If it's a ketana doesn't get punished, right? Minors are not responsible for their actions. They wouldn't get punished. So rather, you can tell from the context that it can't be talking about a ketana, elakan ne'ara. So for sure it's talking about ne'ara. Therefore, he says, I don't need the extra letter he to teach me ne'ara, not ketana. So why is there this extra letter? So rather, you know why it has it here? So we could derive from this case to other cases. Since in this case we know just logically from the context that it applies to a na'ara, not a ketana. So it comes and writes here na'ara with a he, so that we can infer that when it has a he, then it's talking about na'ara only. If it does not have a he, like in the case of rapist, then that means even if she is a ketana. And that's the derivation of Chachamim against Rabbi Meir to say that the law of the fine, the fines for a rapist and seducer apply not only to a na'ara but also to a ketana. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen.